In this episode, I'm joined by Thomas Huebl, spiritual teacher, author, and international facilitator, whose lifelong work integrates the core insights of mysticism with the discoveries of science. When Thomas's team contacted me to interview him about his new book, Healing Collective Trauma, I was very interested to read Thomas's thoughts on this emerging area. In this interview, Thomas shares his spiritual biography, including his time in Vienna, training as a medical doctor, and his 4-year meditation retreat in the Czech Republic. Thomas goes into detail about his intellectual influences, his spiritual insights, and his 20 years of group facilitation work. Thomas also discusses the challenges and potential pitfalls of combining evidence-based scientific work in the field of trauma and psychology with the subjective authority of the mystic's personal experience. So without further ado, Thomas Huebl. Thomas Huebl, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
And may I congratulate you on the publication of your new book, Healing Collective Trauma, a process for integrating our intergenerational and cultural wounds, which came out on the 1st of December last year.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. I'm very happy with the release, and a lot of work, as you know, goes into such a book. It takes a long time to get it together. So I'm very happy it's out now, yeah.
I'd like to ask you in some detail about the book, and I'd also like to ask you a bit about your life. But I think perhaps first, why did you write this book?
That's a good question. And that's a good question. I think, why did I write the book? I think I wrote the book because, like, my own life journey and my what I learned in the last 20 years of my work, I believe when I, like in the early 2000s, when I started with my groups, and after a few years, I saw like what I write in the book about is the collective trauma integration process, but it's more than that. It's kind of a description of something that I learned about through my groups in a much more vivid way, which is that we are sitting in thousands of years of collective traumatization. Like, trauma is not just a personal experience, and it often appears to us as a biographical experience. And because I saw the magnitude of what trauma really means and how it affects our societies and our lives, it's like a global pandemic that very few people heard about. And we heard about it a lot. Of course, everybody knows about the Holocaust and knows about the genocide in Rwanda, about racism in the US. But the effect that it creates for us, how it literally affects us, was so obvious to me at a certain point doing these groups. And I thought this needs to be much more known. We need to talk about this more and get many more people involved in a kind of a conversation about it. I think that was the main reason for the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very interesting. One of the key points you make in the book, which is very fascinating, I'd like to ask you about a little bit later, is this idea of what we know about individual trauma can be thought of on a societal level. If a person is a constellation of parts, then a society is a constellation of people in a way. Mm-hmm. And so you make some interesting links there. And you also in the book produce quite a summary of trauma theorists like Bessel van der Kolk and so on. And also I think another aspect of the book is your own spiritual interpretation or theories that dovetail, and that combination, very, very fascinating. So, all right, first a little bit about your life. When you were 19 studying medicine at the University of Vienna, you felt a strong calling to have what you called silent time and began spending some time each day in meditation. You write, at 19 years old, I'd begun my own regular meditation practice. And in parallel to my coursework in medical studies, I began investigating many of the world's wisdom traditions. I took these habits with me when I entered medical school in Vienna, where I spent my days working shifts and my nights deep in study. And this culminated at the age of 26 in you leaving medical school and spending 4 years in the Czech Republic with your then wife, where you spent most of your time meditating and in fact encountered some quite profound spiritual shifts. About that time, you said, then I was 26. I'd already come across a lot of things. I read Ken's books. That's Ken Wilber. I practiced a lot of yoga and meditation, did all kinds of workshops. I needed something more intense, which is referring to your 4-year retreat. And you've cited among some of your main inspirations at that time as being Ken Wilber, who you just mentioned in that quote, Ramana Maharshi, Sri Aurobindo, I'm wondering if you could go into some detail about the books you're reading at that time and the workshops that you were attending.
Mhm. Yeah, as you said already, I think one of the powerful inspirations for me. I think when I was 19, I started to read Ken Wilber's books. And it was from the beginning, I thought, wow, that's amazing. And I also came across during my medical studies, I think 2-3 years in, I came across Wilhelm Reich. And I thought, wow, why did I never hear about this before? I mean, then I was already 21 or so something. And then I thought it's very interesting that like I need to go and find it out in a special way when what's written there felt so resonant to me. And so one of the things that I did a lot of workshops and training programs in this body-centered psychotherapy domain. And I went when I was 19. I went for 5 years every week to do my own therapeutic journey, and had sessions every week. And because I was totally into exploring, okay, if there is my interior world, and as you said, I also started spontaneously, like before I even got to know yoga and all that. I felt I need to be quiet every day in order to get to know like deeper places in myself. And that eventually culminated into a daily meditation practice. And then I did all kinds of other workshops that felt resonant to me, where I could explore myself in relation to others and find out more about my inner journey. And and I think through Ken Wilber's work is so amazing because it opens up doors into a whole encyclopedia of references, and it was so interesting. I read so many books at that time. And then when I was 26, as you said, I felt, I felt such a strong calling. And it was also that I loved my medical studies. It was a very hard decision for me to let go of the scientific. I didn't know how long I'm going to go to meditate when I started. I just felt I need to go, and it eventually became more than 4 years. And but that journey was so crucial, and I learned so much during those 4 years about different levels of consciousness or human consciousness, and different levels of meditation and refinement of meditation. And to have a serious meditation practice, in my understanding, takes a lot of practice. And in order to open up different parts of our being to higher consciousness dimensions, that takes a lot of practice. And I was totally into this. I mean, I spent so much time meditating in these 4 years. But it was for me because people around me said, Thomas, what are you doing? Why you're leaving everything? And you were so into medicine. And I really loved it. I was into emergency medicine. I was a paramedic for 9 years, and I was a volunteer for the Red Cross. And I loved it. But then I felt, no, I have to follow this. And I often said to people that didn't understand me at that time, I said, I don't know why I'm doing it, but I feel I'm studying something else. I am studying something that's important. And it was like that. And then as I came out of that retreat and then eventually started to start small workshops, but those workshops grew pretty quickly into large workshops. And so, and then the learning, my studying, like I had very profound experiences in these 4 years. But my study, like all my group work and all the, one-on-one sessions and group sessions and large-scale collective trauma integration processes, it's kind of an ongoing studying and ongoing learning. And that's the beauty, because it's so exciting, because I all the time learn more about life and humanity and all of us and myself. So that's a little bit the journey in a nutshell.
Mm. That's very interesting. I have several. This might ring a bell for you. Some of these.
Yeah, of course. Yeah,
I mean, I've got a whole bunch here. But I'm curious what it was about Wilhelm Reich, and that's a very interesting man with a very interesting life story. which I don't think we have time to go into the details here, unfortunately. But what is it about William Reich's material that so captivated you? And outside of the therapies that you were doing, such, the weekly therapy journeys and so on you were on, what were some of the other workshops that you were engaging in, exploring different parts of yourself?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, with Wilhelm Reich, I felt like, since Reich was also a student of Freud, I felt somebody that takes what spoke a lot to me is like coming from the psychoanalytic dimension and then including the very important aspect of the body and the flow of energy through the body. Seemed to me so crucial and very natural. So it's not because often even the term mental health is kind of misleading, because it seems like, oh, that disorder is just in your mind, but that disorder is in the whole body. We just call it mental health, and we call it, I don't know, any kind of diagnosis that we want to give it, but it suggests that there's a separate mind. And then, of course, in my understanding today, I see very clearly that the fragmentation between physical, emotional, and mental experiences is that fragmentation is a trauma symptom, first of all, but it's also the basis of the architecture of separation. So that's why we end up in a hyper-rational world that is part of a defense mechanism versus a brilliant mind that is a fantastic tool. And these two are very close and often go by unrecognized, and undiscerned. And I think we need to... So that's why I felt that Wilhelm Reich had many great approaches to certain things. Not always it worked out, and maybe it also sometimes, it's trial and error. But it spoke to me very deeply. And later on, when I came across, more to understand trauma and collective trauma myself, so then I could see why I felt attracted earlier on, because I feel the information that speaks to us in our life speaks to what we carry inside anyway, and it activates certain. So I felt Wilhelm Reich activated a part of myself. As did, for example, various yoga traditions or the Kriya yoga tradition. I like Kriya yoga, and I also loved Aurobindo's description of the integral yoga and the higher levels of mind. That's very congruent with my own meditation experience. So and it also through my own meditation practice and through the work with thousands of people so far, I saw, wow, the way we think about time is not anymore timely, which means that we see the future as a point in time ahead of us versus the future, an emergent aspect of higher consciousness in the present moment. That's a huge difference. And that we see we often call history the past, versus integrated history are the structures of consciousness that are present, where we are present with each other today. So our integrated ancestry is speaking right now. And the unintegrated history is the past. And so, but our world is mainly built on the idea that tomorrow is the future. And I often say, no, tomorrow we can just recreate what we recreated already many times in the past. So that's not the future. That's a repetition of the past. It's a repetition compulsion of trauma. And that, I think, misunderstanding of time can have severe consequences, because it boxes our thinking into a framework that I believe is not true. And so that's just one element where, like, the meditation practice and the trauma integration practice, I think, can liberate the part of how we look at the world, through which kind of framework we look at the world, that might limit what we see, how we see the world and how we can meet challenges in the world. Yeah, so that's Wilhelm Reich and yeah, and I did many workshops that are related to that kind of work, and I also did. I was always interested in how the refined perception of our nervous system, and how we can plug in, like how we can train the subtle capacities, how we are perceptive in the subtle dimension. And so how to open those facilities of intuition and instant knowing in ourselves. So that's also a big part. But for me, that also opened up in a way through the meditation practice. I felt that's a capacity that started to grow just through the regular practice and the intense practice. Many of those things just opened up gradually.
You've talked and written about how work done on oneself or in a group, collective work, can have an effect on history in the future and so on. To quote you, God inserted into creation after some time grace. What is grace? Grace means that the future has the power to rewrite the past. Through our consciousness work, we have the power to literally rewrite history. So when you say the work we might do can literally rewrite history, well, how are you defining history in that sense?
Yeah. So as I said before, because sometimes the notion of time that we hold at the moment, I think, is inaccurate. I mean, we need a certain framework of time, which is also rhythm, which is day and night, and the flow of functionality of our daily life. When I buy a plane ticket, or there were times when we bought plane tickets, now we don't, but how we organize our day. But on a deeper level, I saw through the ancestral trauma work, I saw, wow, there is a beautiful saying in the Jewish mysticism where it says, and in the time of the great revelation, there's a siren. In the time of the great revelation, the fathers will turn to their sons, and the sons will turn to their fathers, or the mothers to the daughters. It's like the one generation turns to it, but what it means is that we see, and seeing is presence. Presence and seeing is the same, and presence and seeing and clarity is also the same. So when we see each other, then the former generation and this generation are in a state of presence together, which means they are now. So the integrated ancestry is an energy flow and structures of consciousness that is active right now and gives me a sense of presence with you. My unintegrated history or ancestry or experiences in the collective are chunks of information that is past, and with that it's split off, and it's what in the Eastern traditions we call karma, like postponed experience. And when we talk about history, integrated history is presence, but unintegrated history is the past. So the trauma that my parents, my grandparents went through, my grandparents in the Second World War, that if it's not integrated, it will have an effect in my body, in my emotions, in my thinking, in my way to relate to the world, and how I am able to perceive the world. So I often say when we do trauma integration work, we heal our own biographical trauma history. And so we integrate the energy that couldn't be integrated. So integration is always to become unified and rise up to a higher synergy, to a higher state of integration. So that always means post-traumatic learning. Every trauma that's being integrated creates a learning for the individual or the culture. And when we feel into a trauma, let's say at age 5, something happened to a person, the trauma is not the symptoms that come up for the grown-up person. It's a storage of information in the nervous system at a specific location. And we can access that location in order to heal and integrate the trauma. But the same is true that today, my grandparents' traumatization is part of my nervous system, because we often think the nervous system is too individual, I believe. It's like you as a person, but your nervous system is hundreds of thousands of years old. You know, we didn't invent the nervous system. We have been born into one that has been given to us by the genetic memory of like such a long period of life. And so I'm sitting in a nervous system. My personality is wired in that nervous system, but also my collective history is wired in that nervous system. And that's why when we do trauma work, there is always a ripple effect back in what we call back in time. So it integrates that split of energy of the past, and it also opens up possibilities for me in the future. So it makes me more engaged, more creative, more present, and also more innovative in the way I live my life today. And that's why I say integrating the past is integrating something that was split off in order to make now more full, like more rich. And I think that's a basic principle of trauma work, but it literally also, we are affecting the past, because the question is, what did our ancestors turn to in their darkest moments? And the same is also true for us. Is the higher integrated future of us affecting us now while we are having this conversation? So how the future and the past influence this conversation is very interesting, because often we think the future is something that's separate from now. And I don't think it's separate, it's interdependent.
So you said that initially, you said elsewhere that initially you wanted to go to India, to a Tibetan monastery. That was your initial idea. What was the inspiration behind this idea to go to a Tibetan monastery in particular? Of course, eventually you went to the Czech Republic, but why a Tibetan monastery? You haven't mentioned to Buddhism yet, or you use words like bodhisattva vow and so on in the book. So, of course, you're well informed about it, but you haven't mentioned it yet as a key influence. So why a Tibetan monastery?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Tibetan monastery, because I do, let's say at that time, or let's start differently. In my own being, I have simply like a stronger resonance with some traditions. I mean, I have basically a very strong tradition in resonance with the mystical core of any tradition, because as I explored that deeper, I feel that if I looked into the core principles of yoga, or the core principles of Judaism, or the core principles of Tibetan Buddhism, so there is a whole cultural framework around it, of course, but the essence is very similar. And I loved to explore that kind of mystical flame, as I call it, in the tradition. Not necessarily the religious body around it, but the essential teachings. And as you know, I'm sitting right now in Israel. So on the one hand, I feel a very deep closeness to the Jewish tradition, and I love the ancient teachings of the Jewish tradition. At the same time, I feel a similar closeness to the Tibetan tradition. And at that time, I simply felt I need like an intense practice container for what I felt inside. So, and since I love the Tibetan tradition, I thought I'll go to simply a Tibetan monastery and study there and live there for some time. And then there is a third tradition that I'm deeply resonant with, is the Daoism. Because first of all, I find the Tao Te Ching a fantastic concentration of so many wisdom principles. Like it's the concentrated liquid of a lot of life wisdom. And as many sacred texts contain, in a way, the reader already and all the readers already. And that's fascinating, because we're like sacred texts are different than regular writings. And And I find in these three traditions, those are the traditions that I felt deeply resonant with, and some of the work I deeply explored myself. And yeah, so that's why at that time I wanted to go. But I felt also it gives me maybe an environment that has the intensity that I was looking for.
Yeah.
And it felt very close to my heart.
Buddhism, of course, a very broad tradition with many aspects, and also many living adepts, which is not so guaranteed in some of the mystical traditions. Some adepts are easier to find than others, shall we say. Mm-hmm. I'm curious what it was, if there was anything in particular about Tibetan Buddhism that really resonated with you, perhaps theoretically or practice-wise or aesthetically. And if you ever encountered in your journeys and travels any adepts of that tradition who particularly impressed you.
Yeah, I did since I went to India, I think 3-4 times, and then I went multiple times to Nepal. But since I didn't go to study, so I didn't meet the real mystics of the tradition more than just through listening to lectures and listening, studying the lectures that I could have access to. But there is so that's on the outer world, but on the inner world, like where we connect to like a whole field of consciousness, there it's different. There to be connected to the power of a tradition, and also the mystical tradition, and also to be connected to the what I would call some kind of remembrance of resonances in our own field. There's I feel a different connection. And I had a similar feeling also when I came the first time to Jerusalem, that I walked through the city and I could feel myself walking in, like there are so many time zones in that place. And I felt a different, it's different in the quality, but a similar closeness with that field of information that is here. And so yes, so I can. It's more like on the inner levels, but I never studied with a Tibetan teacher directly.
That's very interesting. And one of the aspects of your book that I think is quite unusual is you do blend very often side by side quite straight trauma therapy with these more, as you call them, universal laws, this sort of mystical dimension. I'm very curious about that. When you talk about this other dimension, you also mention in the book, you use the word akashic, as in akashic records, this idea of a kind of collective memory. It's almost Jungian, some of the ways in which you use that idea in the book. And one also might wonder about things like past lives and so on, although perhaps you've already hinted at your interpretation of this when you discussed the nature of time, as you see it earlier. I'm wondering if you could perhaps talk about how you began to access some of these dimensions. You've talked about your 4-year retreat being a key part where you began to unlock aspects, as you say, of higher aspects of being. It seems more subtle realms, as you've described, or almost psychic, some people might say, almost, some might say, new age, that kind of direction. So I'm curious how it was that you began to experience those sorts of realms.
As I said before, like through contemplative and meditative practices. I think at the beginning, it starts with coming to a different state of internal regulation of the nervous system. And then we learn to deepen that state so that we put ourselves into, it's on the one hand, like in neuroscience terms, we could say we put ourselves into a different brainwave state, but we could also say we put ourselves into a much deeper state of presence. And the more we sink into that presence, we're, on the one hand, it looks like we're slowing down like the flow of reality. And when you slow it down, it's like you open up an image on your tablet or your phone. So you see the image in a much higher resolution. And I believe presence is like inherently connected to a much higher resolution of life. So when the movie is just in a regular speed, you see a film, but when you stop frame by frame, when you stop the movie, you see many more details because it seems like you have more time. And in the mystical traditions, we call like the Buddhist notion of emptiness is not a kind of emptiness that we say, if I put everything that's in this room outside, the room is empty. Spiritual emptiness is that everything is in here, and that's why it looks like empty. If everything is here, nothing can be seen. That's like emptiness in the mystical sense. And when something arises, like the will of life of one lifetime, we make a lot of not me in order to be defined as a me. So if I can see something, a lot of things will not be seen. And the whole spiritual journey is about opening up these channels and identification with a separate sense of self, which I think trauma work adds a lot, and collective trauma work is actually at the architecture, at the base of separation. So through trauma work, we loosen up thousands of years of felt separation in order to touch on some of the mystical states that some of the high mystics talked about, states of unification. That's not just a high-end state, that's also a state where a lot of the separation has been integrated and unified. And so when through the meditation time I had, like by looking at life through this kind of higher resolution, the field of information that is omnipresent here, it becomes more accessible because I'm in a state that has access to that field. In a faster state, it seems like those fields are hidden. That's why some people say, yeah, the mystical teachings are hidden. Yeah, they're only hidden because we are not in the internal state that can reveal them. They're not hidden by somebody vicious or by the great villain of the universe. They are hidden because we are unable to speak the language of that dimension of life. And that's why, as you said, I find it very fascinating that I believe the voice of contemporary science and the voice of the mystical science, that's also what I did in the book. I allowed these two voices to have a dialogue because I think within that dialogue, there are lots of revelations. And so that we learn that thousands of years of unrestored human pain create a life of separation that we took as normal. We said, okay, that's how life is. And I would say, no, that's not how life is. That's how life is when it's hurt. And when life is partly hurt, then it creates a lot of symptoms. So the invisible trauma field is also part of that information field that you spoke about. And the more that's what I also wrote in the chapter about the facilitators. I think one capacity that we need to have in order to do trauma work or collective trauma work is to work on our inner state of presencing and also our inner state of perception. So how perceptive we are is crucial, because when we sit with one person, when we sit with a group, or when we tune in with the collective trauma of a nation, we are talking about information that is stored in the collective unconscious. It's like, maybe the last thing, and then for that answer is, like, if you say that trauma is, you see on the TV a crazy war scene, you take your remote control and you mute it. And so it's still playing, but it's without sound. So when I'm in a traumatized moment, life is still around, but I feel like a bit ghosty, disembodied, like two-dimensional. I'm in a shock state. And then we take the TV screen and we throw it into the ocean. And slowly, and the scene is still playing, the movie is still on, and it drops slowly into the darkness of the ocean. So when we take an event like a Holocaust, deep down on the collective consciousness ocean, there are many TVs still playing scenes of concentration camps and war scenes and stuff. But here, where we are, it doesn't appear, but it's here in the room.
Mm.
And I think that access to that information, and why often we don't have access to that information, because it's turned unconscious and it's resting down in the darkness. Many millions of TVs are still playing those scenes. That's, I believe, what we don't see here, because our perception has no access to that usually. But that's what that pain really means.
Mm. It's interesting as you talk, you weave in sort of multiple different levels at once. You talk sometimes from a psychological perspective, and then perhaps mid-sentence we'll switch to a metaphorical or a spiritual perspective, talking about, TV screens in the dark. That's almost Jungian collective unconscious idea, and epigenetics, of course, more kind of biological and neurobiological model and so on. And then these other spiritual ideas. And of course, these different disciplines have quite different standards of evidence claim and truth. So I'm wondering why you weave them together like that. Is there a danger of giving some of the, should we say, spiritual language or spiritual ideas the same equivalency, let's say, of verification by, say, scientific means, as we might find in some of the more scientific literature? Because as I'm tracking there what you're saying, there's science, there's psychology, there's spiritual, there's speculation, even the use of the Buddhist notion of the word emptiness. Within Buddhism, that's a very broad philosophical debate. There isn't really a Buddhist notion of emptiness, as you know, of course. So is there a danger, do you think, of creating confusion by speaking so many levels, one after the other, and interlacing them like that? Or why do you do that?
Yeah, like we need to be precise when we discuss epigenetics, we need to discuss epigenetics in the framework of biology or genetics, or like the genetic sciences, and that there is a very science-based or evidence-based process of unfolding or knowledge acquisition. And that's true. When we speak within that framework, we need to be precise with the rules of the framework, same as psychology or neuroscience. At the same time, if we just stay in the silos of those disciplines, we might miss the interdisciplinary fabric that they are part of, because they are not separate. We can look at them separately. We can look at the rules. So I think if we looked at, or if you're looking at, for example, the mice experiment of Isabel Manzui, that shows the epigenetic changes of kind of childhood traumatization of young mice. In that sense, it's true. We need to look at the evidence in the framework of an evidence-based evaluation. But at the same time, I believe we also run into the danger that we separate certain aspects of life into silos, and then we are missing the fabric that connects them, because a human being is not just epigenetics, because my epigenetics are being influenced by our conversation right now. So would I separate my relation to you from my epigenetics? No, so the spiritual dimension looks at as Thich Nhat Hanh says, the dimension of interbeing. So how is my epigenetic landscape and your epigenetic landscape now in relation or in a state of interbeing? And how do we influence each other? And I think if we don't manipulate the science, because we are changing the evidence-based findings and the context, then we can weave or at least open up a conversation how they are related. So we are talking about the science in a way of relating those different aspects back into like one space in which they can speak to each other. And that's what I also, for example, do with our Collective Trauma Online Summit. So there are 50 speakers that are coming from different various disciplines, and we have conversations with all of them, given their background, if they're psychologists or doctors or, I don't know, social justice lawyers. And then we look at how those voices communicate within a space. And that's why I'm looking also a lot for this kind of interdisciplinary dialogue. But I think spirituality needs to be part of it. It cannot be excluded because it's such an essential part of our being. And maybe it also has a kind of the function of a fabric that hosts various parts of ourselves and our science traditions.
I see. So in a certain sense, the spiritual view, are you saying you see it as a sort of meta view or a kind of overarching view that might provide a way of unifying various different disciplines, such as science, for example? Because there are others who might consider, let's say, science to be the overarching view that could perhaps explain the divergent opinions within the different spiritual traditions. For example, it could be flipped that way also.
I think both is true. I think they are not separable. Like that's what I meant before. Like they are interdependent wholes. So science and mystical science, they belong to each other. So spirituality will be represented in neuroscience, for example, or in psychology or somewhere, and the other way around. But the interesting aspect is, what's the dialogue? What's the movement between them? So that there's not one superior version, but there's the expression of interdependence. Yes. And I think relation or communication is in a way the expression of that interdependence, right? That's true. I see it the same way. Yeah.
That's interesting. Let me continue to ask you a bit about this. You know, I mentioned in your book that, of course, you present your 4-part process for working with collective trauma that you've developed over these 20 years of running workshops with very interesting, as you mentioned before, and as you describe in the book in quite a lot of detail. One of the real crucibles for that, one of the real learning for that was the working with, in Germany, group memories of the Holocaust coming up and spreading through a group of people who weren't even often alive at the time of those events. Those sorts of things that you were having in your encounter group meetings, eventually over time you developed this 4-part CTIP process. And you also talk about trauma, and you mentioned a bit of shadow work and some spiral dynamics also in there. And as I mentioned before, you also make quite a lot of spiritual claims about the nature of reality and so on. So, for example, you write, "We are each a pulsing fiber optic cable alive in a matrix of light. The source of this light, whatever we call it, source energy, life's seed, the divine, touches us from the authentic future. It's an evolutionary intelligence that seeks to download itself into and through us. From this conscious, ever-emergent wellspring, we're offered the full accumulated treasure of human life. It exists within us as an electricity that rushes upward vertically along every familial thread and arcs out horizontally along the fibers of our nervous systems, connecting each to the other and animating the full current of humanity in vibrating unison. The divine human matrix carries the encoded story of our race back to its very genesis. All those today have been entrusted to hold this living record and chosen by evolution to update and renew it to a new tomorrow. When a human incarnates, a stream of light enters into and travels upward along millennia of spiraling DNA and accumulated genetic histories. Pushing through thousands of years of karmic substrate, a single human soul emerges into a world weighed down by ancient, modern, and postmodern bands of tribal pain and cultural trauma. Its light surfaces finally at the conception and crown of a single bawling infant. Each child is new and innocent and perfect, but has entered an incomprehensible story, one requiring great strength of spirit." It seems in that passage you're talking about DNA, talking about evolution, but then you're also talking about divine light, source energy, incarnation, this idea of intentionality behind being gifted with certain things. Other places you've written about people being gifted with the sort of circumstances of their life, people with sensitive nervous systems, for instance, is a gift that's needed for their incarnation. This is a sense of there's a gifting happening. Almost every sentence has the psychological, the scientific, in an evolutionary biology sense, and the spiritual woven together. And at the end, the summary, as you've said, your summary is of a spiritual nature. So, one thing that did strike me as I read the book is if one pays close attention, one can see, I think, that what you've said is you're attempting to create a dialogue between these different elements, let's say evolutionary biology, the psychological, and the spiritual. Well, I suppose I could return to my previous question: is there a danger of muddling them, or of creating a false equivalency? And doesn't evolution sound a bit like depth psychology? Doesn't depth psychology remind us a little bit of spirituality, something like this? And there can be perhaps some problems there. Another related problem, I think, or that's not a problem, a related something else that struck me, and I'm wondering what the thinking was behind this. You quite rigorously cite all the trauma work. You are careful to describe the key thinkers, and you provide lots of citations for their books. But as far as I could see, you don't cite any sources for the spiritual side, the spiritual theme. You've got two citations for Lao Tse, and that's related to your appendix, when you give some exercises about connecting with the inner light. And in the book, I don't think refer to any spiritual traditions, even specifically. You've done so here in this interview. You use words like Chi and Bodhisattva, and like we said, Akasha, and you talk about the Sarira Triad and so on. Why, I'm curious, did you choose to cite the trauma so thoroughly, but give no citations or references in terms of the lineages of thought for the spiritual side?
Yeah, I think that since, like as you said, I'm representing also through my own journey, like a kind of a mystical path that is also strongly represented in the way I do the work with clients or groups, or so that there are certain mystical principles that are that kind of opened up in myself naturally through my practice. And so what I describe in the book is not derived from multiple traditions or books that I read about it. It's coming out of my whatever direct experience, and I'm speaking in the book only about when you ask me about the spiritual principles, I am speaking only about the things that I experience in the process work myself. I'm not talking about things that I read somewhere, but I'm referring to, let's say, the energetic knowledge that I practice and use every day in the work on trauma or collective trauma. And that's why what you correctly referred to, there are no citations, because that is not knowledge that I read about. That's something that opened up within myself. And that's also how I relate to people. And also that's what I teach about human process work. So how we use our nervous system as a modeling capacity for another nervous system, like when we create relational resonance, and we can create in ourselves an environment that is very conducive for another person to slowly open up trauma content into relation in a safe way. And that we can look at trauma. I cited the scientific because there's a lot of knowledge about science that many people, brought together. But all the mystical principles that I describe in the book are based on my own experience. That's my direct experience of the work with people, the human practices that I also teach is what I do myself and what I model a lot in all our groups and programs in front of many, many people. When somebody asks a question or brings in a topic and we work on it together, how we go through the process is exactly what I describe in the book. So basically, it's not something that it's not knowledge that I read about, and that's why I need to quote but it's something that is part of my daily experience, and that's maybe why you picked up on that there are no citations in the book. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So the source of authority for the trauma work is the science, which I think strengthens those sections a lot. The source of authority in terms of the spiritual side is your own authority, your own insight as an individual.
Right. And there are references then that are very like resonant with, as I said before, like when I look at Ken Wilber's work, there are many aspects that he describes in the various levels of consciousness that I can relate my experience to, or if I read Aurobindo's work with the higher levels of consciousness, and or the yoga practice in the internal anatomy, or Chinese medicine, when we talk about qi and vitality and life energy. Yes. So there I can make a lot of references, and I can also be as I am also in dialogue with people that are coming from those various fields. So it's not an isolated authority. That's important to say. Like, I'm looking a lot for the dialogue with many people to open that up as an invitation to be in dialogue also with people from various traditions or various scientific backgrounds.
Okay, so you mean you're seasoning your spiritual information that you've had revealed to you with dialogue with scientists,
but also people from spiritual traditions. Yeah, right.
None of which you cite, though. None of whom you cite.
No, because that's not the source of the information that I quote, like that I write about in the book. So it's not a quoting of people's information.
Okay. Something I wondered about that, you're mentioning there about the way you train facilitators and so on, or the way you teach facilitation, perhaps a better way of saying it. You write about your facilitators. The most important thing of these things that they ought to be able to do is include the capacity to do the following. Rest in and return to witness consciousness. Be wholly present with the intense and dynamic energies of a large group, rather than becoming activated or triggered by those energies due to one's own unhealed content. Make energetic connections and integrate instincts and intuitions with cognitions. Hold a group's subtle field in one's awareness, whatever the scale, and accurately read such a field. Perceive the mass energy waveforms of a group field, as well as wisely induce and gently direct those waves in search of the group process, and with the care of all in mind. Connect to the future light, in order to download its organizing intelligence into the past, so that it may heal, clarify, and release our individual and collective potential. And you also write that with healing practice we can learn to zoom in and feel deeply into or align with any of the holographic coordinates of the energetic nervous system in both ourselves and others. By developing this skill, we can learn to use our own nervous system to attune in relation to that of another. This allows us to access impressions or emotional sensations relating to experiences that occurred at specific points in space and time. This subtle competency grows in clarity as we learn to connect through the receiver of our own nervous system, establishing a data connection through deeper precision. By attuning to another person in this way, always with permission, we can simply feel within our own system the approximate age or stage in life at which painful experience or trauma occurred. This is the cosmic address. So the final point, I think, before I ask, your 4-part group process involves getting people together, engaging in certain attunement building exercises, mirror moving and so on, talk process, etc., and then dropping in a topic like the Holocaust and opening up the group for people to then say what they like. And then you describe this pattern that you've observed over the 20 years of how it tends to go. First of all, there's denial, and then someone says something, and then there's a total outpouring of everyone then talking about it, and then you have to be careful there to tie it up in a certain way, and usually the group will do that organically and start to reflect and sort of look ahead and move on. You've got to sort of shepherd that process. Very, very amazing that you've witnessed that over those, observed that over the years of working with these groups. So I'm curious, on the one hand, that process could be seen as a psychological intervention, the sort of thing for human potential movement, kind of group therapy process structure, reminiscent in some ways of, for instance, Paul Lowe, who was an influence or figure in your history, famous for doing that sort of a group process, similar, not the same structure, that's your process, but in the Osho days and so on and beyond. One could see it as a sort of psychological intervention, and then one can back that up with the trauma literature. Why is the spiritual aspect necessary for that kind of a group process, other than it being how you experience what you're doing? Why is it necessary to describe it with the additional spiritual part? Could you have, in other words, have written a book where you talked about the trauma therapy, you presented your 4-part model, and left it at that? Do we need to talk about, divine seeds and connecting to the light and channeling and so on? What's the necessity of that? Is there a danger of mixing the scientific with its verifications, the psychological with its means of assessment, and your own mystical experience? Why is that done like that?
Yeah, I think first of all, when we talk about spiritual, I think it's good to look at how we define spiritual. I think, and that's from my perspective, and that's why I wrote the book that I wrote, is that there is kind of a phobia sometimes in the current marketplace, in the current world, to engage with mystical or spiritual aspects, because at first it might look like it's not evidence-based, it's not so easily to follow or to put into clear descriptions. So yes, I agree. So that's there. But then we found that scientifically it's at least mindfulness has become an evidence-based understanding that what mystical traditions say for thousands of years, that meditation and presence and deeper states of presence are simply very beneficial, needed to be confirmed by neuroscience in order to find an agreement that that's something that is evidence-based. And I believe we are living in a time where we transcended in a way in our current societies and also in the scientific mindset, we transcended in a way the shadow side of religion, but we also try to create a more sterile environment when it's about because the spirituality is on the one hand different states and meditative states and mindfulness that we can measure, but it also has a dimension of higher aspects of consciousness that are not easily measurable. And in the mystical traditions, there are descriptions of kind of ethical ways of walking in life that are key elements to find orientation in the way we live ethically together as human beings. And so if there was a big spiritual collective trauma that has happened through kind of collective movements or religious movements that enforced their power through the religious mindset, which created a lot of, I think, trauma and the shadow side of that. But on the other hand, when we exclude that dimension as not evidence-based, we are missing a very deep internal referencing and kind of ethical way of walking. And so one aspect of every serious spiritual tradition is kind of an ethical code or an ethical alignment that is speaking to the way of how we live as a human being in daily life, in what's right relation, and how we respect each other's dignity, how we train compassion, and many other things. And so the reason why I could have written the book without the whole spiritual dimension, just based on the trauma science and make a collection of all of that. But first of all, that's not authentic to me. And secondly, I believe that the dimension of the mystical voice needs to be reintroduced into the discourse in a new way. And we need to heal the trauma that happened, but also listen to the thousands of years of introspection and experimental introspection that is also a long chain of That's also a tradition that is based on something. It's not just anything can happen. And so I believe to spark the dialogue, even if at the beginning it brings up a lot of questions, also a lot of evidence questions, I think is a good thing, because I'm missing that voice sometimes in our society as an important voice too, not as the voice, but as part of that holistic dialogue. And I see this also as part of my own journey, how to combine the scientific voice and the mystical voice and have them have a dialogue. And then we see what we find out. But I would love to have that dialogue. And as I said, the spiritual aspects that I described in the book are, as you said, are based on my own experience and are based on the way I teach process facilitation and how we use things like presencing, or as Otto Schama also talks about the theory U and the innovation capacity, how we connect to real innovation and what's vertical literacy. So I believe all of those things are important. And that's why I wrote it that way. Yes.
Yeah. I think it's a shame that it is a fascinating dialogue. As a mystic, your mystic voice, I mean, not the mystic voice, but your mystic voice would be a way of saying it. What you've come to find through your spiritual practice, very potent stuff, amazing. What you've discovered doing psychological work in group meetings and the trauma science, that is an interesting dialogue. It's a shame, I think, that the spiritual was not framed more clearly as being your, if you want, direct spiritual insights, which would, I think, contextualize it somewhat differently from 20 years of working with people and so on. I think it's in danger maybe of undermining some of the insights that you have about collective trauma because of the authority issue of the spiritual things that are presented as fact in the book, really. Or as statements of fact, spiritual fact, but still they're as statements of fact. But that's just perhaps my reading. But one of the ways of course, evaluating the efficacy of an intervention like CTIP is in terms of its outcomes. And you write actually about that here. The collective trauma process isn't a clean, linear procedure with a direct, programmable outcome. To understand it, we can organize it into stages and waves. But it isn't a machine into which X input offers Y outcome. The CTIP is a complex system. The components that enter into it, beginning long before we show up to the process, are variable and vast. It takes group intelligence and dedication and synergy for the process to work. And the outcome of the process, whether it's conducted well or poorly, will be expressed exponentially at the system scale. It isn't just the participants who experience the effects, but the families, communities and cultures they interact with going forward. The CTIP is acupuncture for the collective body. The most humbling gift of the work is the recognition that afterwards there is a felt vibrational upgrade wherever it occurred. When CTIP healing is repeated in a particular city, region or country, many feel that the energetic composition of the society begins to shift. Blocked evolutionary energies are released, and innovation can surge. Over time, a problematic zone may become prosperous and thriving. Perhaps this sounds outlandish, yet I and many others have observed these radical shifts again and again. And you mentioned there a felt vibrational upgrade as a consequence of the group process, blocking of energies and an increase in prosperity in areas, and which you describe as radical shift. But you don't give any specific examples or anecdotal examples, for example. It seems an important point to leave unsubstantiated, the outcomes of the process. Could you perhaps say something about why outcomes weren't included, and perhaps some of the examples of the things you've noticed as an outcome?
Yeah, because we are, for example, at the moment, because as you said before, like as I wrote at the beginning, that the outcome in a complex system is not easy to measure. So the impact of like multiple CTIPs, for example, on Berlin, or a place where we did it more often, is not so easy to measure. So what we are now in the phase of that we created 4 years ago a non-profit organization. It's called the Pocket Project. And we are now working on 23 different labs, which are groups that are exploring collective trauma in different areas of the world. And we created now a structure where we have a very tight kind of questionnaire, scientific evaluation of participants, of the facilitators, of the whole organization. We created like a meta learning platform, and so we are trying now to look at some more evidence-based data that we collect, but it takes us some time to set up a structure to do that. So, and the other part is that in the Academy of Inner Science, our kind of teaching platform, we developed like a PhD program and an MA program, and there are currently some students that are writing the PhD on collective trauma, and they're using the data. So we are looking now to feed that in, what we saw through and what we felt through the experiences of the CTIPs. We are looking now how to create a scientific environment. And I also had once a conversation with Otto Scharmer, like how because he is also very interested in system sensing and awareness-based system transformation. And we talked about the difficulty to find like methods how to create evidence-based structures that we can show those changes that might be experienced by some people or groups of people, but they are hard to put in words. But so we don't have the references yet because there are no publications about this. There is nothing that we can reference because I think we are developing in a way also a new field at the moment. But what we see is that through the unblocking of that material, and I want to say something because you mentioned before encounter groups. I want also to say that what we are doing is not encounter work, just to be precise, because we are not triggering the trauma content in the group through an active trigger. So we are not going and creating more confrontational challenges for people to touch on deeper emotional release. And we are also not looking for a kind of emotional catharsis or a strong expression. So it's not that we are creating these groups to bring this stuff onto the surface. It's more that we are looking, okay, what's actually the collective coherence that we can build in order to create enough safety in the group that certain content is surfacing naturally. And that's I just want to be precise because I'm also very critical with some of the encounter work that pushes information into the awareness of people and where we create confrontational situations to trigger those. And I want to just differentiate that that's not first of all, not what I believe in process-wise. And secondly, that I think sometimes it's counterproductive to the trauma integration. So we are looking at how the relational container can be safe enough that in the nervous system, naturally, certain content is being liberated by itself without external triggers or force. And so just I wanted to mention this to be precise because you mentioned that before. And the other thing is that we can see in people that came to multiple CTIPs, we could see the decrease in their own experience of the trigger and the amount of information that came up, and how people can stay more connected to themselves, even if we deal with very painful past, like Second World War or racism or whatever we are looking at, and how this inner state of integration grows and how that develops a natural like a different sense of flow in their life, and also like a different flow in the way their expression and participation in the world is changing. And so how that creates an upgrade also in everybody's vitality, engagement, also prosperity, and the way we influence culture. And that it's of course a process, that it's not just 1 to 100, but we see a continuous upgrade, and also how people more and more actually feel motivated to engage in society and in the societal process, but from a more regulated place. And that usually creates environments that are more stable and more creative, co-creative, fertile, and also support new structures in society to grow. So even if we go, there's some kind of healing phase, and then it opens up to kind of a new state of living in a way, where the stagnation that was there before turns into like more aliveness and participation. And that usually it comes with a big change or some kind of gradual change in people's lives.
In the description of the process, talking about encounter groups there, you do mention that once enough presence and coherence has been established, we can invite the topic and purpose of our gathering into the room. But you're clarifying now that you wouldn't invite the topic and purpose of the gathering into the room by, say, mentioning the Holocaust, for example.
Yeah, I would not do it. Like encounter groups often have that element of we are in a way triggering people
through psychodrama, for instance.
Yeah, through all kinds of methods in order to touch deeper emotions. And we are not so much interested in the emotional release, although that happened in the processes that I saw,
right,
that it came up for many people, but that's not our main purpose. And we are always looking how to regulate that enough so that it's not getting too strong. So there are ways how to slow down processes that we can digest what comes up. Otherwise, it just creates more activation for people. And that's kind of a different way of working.
Yeah, that's very interesting that you should point to that, because there are trends which you're criticizing here where trauma or reactivity is stirred up for the feeling of an emotional catharsis, and that's seen to be intrinsically a good thing, regardless of its outcomes further down the line, which is why I brought up the outcomes that, as an important part. A process can appear to be meaningful and to feel good in the moment. There can be use the word felt vibrational change, but without close attention to the outcomes beyond the container, it can be the case, as you said, in encounter groups and in any process in which the outcomes aren't tracked in some way. It can be either neutral or damaging, perhaps, or good, but we just don't know unless we track it. And I think it seems an important next step. This book, in a certain sense, seems a hypothesis of this is something you've got, your process, there's the trauma work, your own spiritual, if you want, revelations. For that process to carry more weight, there need to be something more than a felt vibrational change or things seem lighter or something like that. So it's good to know that you're trying to figure out how you might verify the efficacy of these ideas.
Yeah, that's what I said before. I mean, there are many people that went through these processes. And some of them are, in long-term training programs, so we can track their development. So we know something about it. And since it's also a very young field, we are creating now, in the last years, the appropriate structure that can also be scientifically evaluated. And so we will gain more and more data, and I think we will gain more and more backup data for the processes. So it's not just based on a felt experience in the room. The other part is also that I believe the book talks about the CTIP, but another part of the book is also speaking to a phenomenon of the trauma that is often seen as a personal experience is embedded in a whole web of life, and that many systems within our society are being affected by trauma without us often being aware that that's what we are affected by. And I think I want to put this just in perspective, that the book talks about the history, like trauma science and the collective trauma. And then we are also talking in the last chapters about what's the systemic co-creative effect that we see in the healthcare system, in the education system, in many other systems. And so I see this as an equal contribution of the book to spark a conversation about the necessity to think trauma as a systemic factor, and it affects, structures in our societies. It affects how we are able as societies to respond to a COVID crisis or a climate crisis. So there are many aspects where I think, including the dimension of collective trauma, when we deal with societal issues. For example, we see now a massive fragmentation, like in the States or in relation to the pandemic and the political situation in many countries in Europe and other places in the world. When there is a collective stress factor, like COVID or climate change, the fragmentation in the society is just becoming more obvious. And I think
Yeah.
besides the process, that's an equally important part of the book to point towards that as an invitation for a conversation.
Certainly, you make many comments on that, and very interesting. And perhaps I'm aware of the time, Thomas. We're now at the end of our time together. Thank you, by the way, for being so generous with your time. So maybe I'll finish with this. You lay out towards the end of the book your vision for what could a society look like, or a world look like, if the processes that you describe in the book were able to come to their full flowering, such as the healing of the individual and the collective trauma and so on, and the ideas that you're setting forth. And you write, higher capacities for distance learning, precognition, and enhanced experiences of connectedness and union will no longer simply be possible, but accessible. The miracles attributed to ancient mystics and religious sages will become a part of the everyday. The bright worlds of fantasy and science fiction will no longer seem illusory but prophetic. Through integrity, faith, and the courage to love, our highest mystery will inevitably be revealed. Our ancient myths and fairy tales have always suggested as much, and deep in our hearts we know it to be true. But this story requires more than the will and courage of a single hero or heroine. It calls out for the intelligent whole, the awakened collective, activated by many voices, raised in unison. And that's your part of your vision for what could be in store if these processes are allowed to flower, as you're suggesting. Well, would you like to comment on that last part, or is that...
Yeah, I would like to comment on that because I think that's a kind of a more poetic description of something we could say. In other words, that if trauma is at the base of separation, and if when we are in an internal trauma fragmentation, we see ourselves and the world as separate, and the wisdom traditions and all the compassion based and contemplation based traditions talk about like a deeper state of unification. But that deeper state of unification is not just like a higher state that we attain. It's also like a deeper restorative state that will help us to transcend certain levels of separation, because they are basically trauma cracks. So it's like I take a stone and I throw it at a window, and then I see the cracks in the glass. And so we are looking through that kind of glass when we are looking through unconscious trauma. So there's othering, there's fragmentation, there's racism, there are many social issues that we produce out of looking through the unconscious trauma. And not only does it affect our perception, but it affects the way we act and the way we treat each other and the way we create an environment in the world that provides for much more equality and for much more flourishing for many people, not just super privileged people. And I think that kind of poetic description is also in let's say more scientific ways that at the base of separation is not just first of all, it's not just a spiritual thing. It's a very alive stuff in our nervous system. And the second aspect is also that it's that I believe when we heal PTSD or complex PTSD and we slowly go deeper, or when we collectively start to heal some of the massive fragmentations that, for example, racism created, or like a Holocaust created, or a Rwandan genocide created. So when those fragmentations start to heal or integrate, we we always come to kind of a deep ethical question, like the question, the unconsciousness that led to those choices to do those things, becomes evident again. And I think there is something about the ethical learning or the ethical line of intelligence, as Ken Wilber calls it, like our kind of ethical alignment is deeply asked for when we go deeper with the trauma integration. And I believe only so that there's integration of PTSD and everything that's connected to it, but deeper down, there's also an ethical restoration needed. And I think that's where the way we live, and that's where the wisdom traditions come together, that unification is not just a far out thing, it's also a very grounded down to earth thing that stems from our ethical choices.
Thomas, I would love to quiz you further about a CTIP process. It's really interesting, but I'm afraid I think we're out of time now. Thank you for being so generous with your time and for coming on here to discuss your new book, Healing Collective Trauma, available now, sounds true. And perhaps where's the best place for people to find you and to find the results of the outcomes research that you're doing and so on?
Yeah, so one is like thomashuebl.com, Huebl with Huebl, thomashuebl.com, one word. And the other one is the pocketproject.org, pocketproject.org. That's our NGO. That's where we do, and that's also who everybody who is interested can, sign up for a newsletter or get much more information. We're publishing our new website. There will be a study room. That's our meta-learning platform, and there we'll publish all the new insights and all the new results will be published there.
Fascinating. I'll include all of that information in the show notes. So Thomas Huebel's book, Healing Collective Trauma, available now from Sounds True. Thomas Huebl, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.